Thank you very much, Anne. It's a delight to be here. So I'm going to start off with a puzzle and an anecdote. And I won't solve the puzzle for you until the end. So the puzzle is this. This was a study done of a group of people in their mid-70s whose memory was a bit fragile. They had a mini mental state score of around 24 out of 30, so it was fragile memory. So they followed them up over 2 years and looked at their memory and cognitive function at the beginning of that period and then at the end of that 2-year period. And then they looked at those of them in that 2-year period who had had a stress-free 2 years, compared to those that had stresses during that 2-year period, different types of stresses. And they found a remarkable thing. They found that those people with fragile memories in their 70s who had had moderately stressful events occurring during that 2-year period maintained their memory and cognitive function without a drop, in comparison to those whose 2-year period was stress-free, where there was a drop. So that's my puzzle for you to try and explain that, and I'll come back at the end. Here's my anecdote. I was in New York 2 or 3 years ago, sitting in one of these nice coffee bars, and couldn't help overhearing this kind of loud conversation beside me. It was an older man, I would say in his 70s, mentoring, it transpired in my eavesdropping, man in his mid-30s. And it was clear that the man in his mid-30s had done a PhD, had worked in academia, and was now trying to decide whether to branch out into industry or the commercial world, or whether just to make his career in academia. That was the scenario. I remember the older man saying to him, so I start my timer too late, saying to him, well, you know, you've got 50, maybe 60 working years ahead of you. So, and now that phrase stuck in my mind. Here was someone talking to a mid-30s or maybe early 30s who was thinking, unselfconsciously, that this man would be working until his 80s or 90s, assuming. And it was clear that this 70-year-old was still very, very active. And that tallied with our experience of 4 months in New York, is this sense of relief of a ceiling being pulled from you in terms of expectations about, what being older, I'm 65 now, what does that mean? I'm being forced to retire by Trinity in the end of September. Fortunately, I have a new job, but I don't want to retire. I don't feel ready to retire. But so there's that across the water. There's that rejuvenating sense of an aging glass ceiling having been lifted from in New York. So I want to come back to that anecdote as well. Now, a little bit of statistics. How many of you are in your 50s in this room, if you don't mind putting up your hand? Okay. Many of you are in your 60s? Okay. So here's the news. From about the age of 20, all of our cognitive functions, most of our cognitive functions, not all of them, show a steady decline. Okay? Decade by decade. So you can calculate a ratio of the average cognitive function of someone in their mid-60s compared to the average cognitive function of someone in their mid-50s, and you will find a bit of a dip. Okay, I'm less mentally sharp than my mid-50s colleagues, for instance. So you can then look at that country by country to see how much less smart than the average 50-year-old is the average 60-year-old. So you get the ratio. The 60s, 50s mental sharpness ratio. And then you can do the kind of what economists do all the time, which is to compare across countries and to compare with another measure. And you can create another measure about 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds, and that is how many fewer 60-year-olds are working compared to 50-year-olds. Okay? And then you can plot these two ratios. Okay? The proportion of people in their 60s who are working compared to people in their 50s, and how much less mentally sharp the average person in their 60s is compared to the average person in their 50s. And here's the remarkable finding. In the USA, about 30% fewer 60-year-olds are in work than 50-year-olds. In France, it's 90%. And you get this rather beautiful, linear, straight-line relationship that the more 60-year-olds are still in work, the smarter they are relative to 50-year-olds. In France, the ratio, the average 60-year-old's about in USA, the average 60-year-old's about 5% less sharp than the average 50-year-old. It's a small, I'm only 5% if I was in America, less smart than the average 50-year-old. But in France, the average 60-year-old is 20% less smart than the average 50-year-old. And what's more, if you give the standard memory tests that Dr. O'Neill will give in his clinic and we all give to measure memory, usually something like a list of 12 words, and you read the list of 12 words and you have to remember them, and then 30 minutes later you have to repeat them. It's a standard memory test. So you can get your memory is a very, very critical part of your cognitive function. So you can also measure how good people's memory is across nations. And in the USA, the average 60-year-old scores 11 out of 12 on one of these memory tests. In France, it's 8 out of 12. That's not because the French are stupider, but it's because it's telling us something very fundamental about what policies about retirement do to people's brains. There's a wonderful longitudinal study in aging called TILDA being done in Ireland. Are any of you taking part? Any people who are part of the TILDA study? Yes, at least one there, two there. So being followed up, this is 9,000 Irish people, a stratified a fully representative sample. Roseanne Kenny is the leader of this. And one of the measures in that study is what one's expectations of aging are. And people in this room and people vary in what, if you ask them what their expectations about getting older are. And some people have more negative expectations than others. And one of the researchers in TILDA, Deirdre Robertson, she took this measure at one point in the TILDA study and looked at people's walking speed. And these were mainly people in their 50s and 60s, with a few older groups. She looked at their walking speed now and then 2 years later. And what she found was that those with negative expectations of aging began to walk significantly slower over the 2-year period. What's more, their cognitive functions went down significantly more, particularly so-called executive function, the frontal lobes, than those with more positive expectations of aging. And they also began to loosen some of their social ties, discard some of their social activities a little bit. And this is remarkable because the large number of 50-year-olds here, so you don't associate 50-year-olds with walking slower, but here you have somehow a negative expectation of aging resulting in speed of walking. Now, why is that important? Speed of walking is an incredibly powerful predictor of one's general mental and physical robustness. It's a very, very strong indicator of just how well one is coping with growing older. So here's me coming to the crux of my argument today, which is that of ageism and of the consequences of ageism on our physical and mental and emotional functions as older people in relation to policies, in relation to our contribution to society. And here's my hypothesis, or my question for you, is are we as older people unconsciously fostering ageism by disempowering ourselves through a systematic stepping out of engagement with the world, particularly in the workplace? And are we allowing younger people ageist attitudes not only to cause prejudice and discrimination against us, even more worryingly, to embed themselves in our own minds in such a way that quite unconsciously we begin to walk slower. We internalize some of these stereotypes. The evidence is that if I was to give half of you a memory test and prime you with negative images of aging before giving you that memory test, you would perform worse as a group of older people than if I primed you with neutral images about aging. Our unconscious assumptions and beliefs about aging and representations of aging have huge effects on our actual performance, how sharp we are, how fast we are, how well we remember, how confident we are. I'm struck by how many people hit a crisis when they have to retire, like I will in a couple of months at 65, and how many people slip out of engaging with life into, playing golf, and that suits some people very well. But I'm struck by the current candidates for the US presidency, who are respectively 68, Hillary Clinton, and 70, Donald Trump. I'm struck by the power mongers of the world who are very few of them are under 60. Erdogan, Putin, Rupert Murdoch is in his 80s. What is it about some people who seem to be immune to these kind of sinister, disempowering, disengaging kind of thoughts that we have about aging that were so manifestly not apparent in that older man mentoring the young man that I overheard in that restaurant, that cafe in New York? So I'll say one more thing about poor old France. In France, they have lavish pension schemes, lavish. And even for the self-employed, there are state pension schemes. And as a self-employed person, you can choose to retire at 60 or 65. And the study showing quite conclusively that those that choose to retire at 60, and that they're not any sicker, that's been shown, they're not any sicker, nor are they more impoverished financially. They choose to step out at 60. They develop Alzheimer's disease significantly more than those who keep working till they're 65. So here is the challenge, the question for you: Are we coddling ourselves as older people? In my book, The Stress Test, the journey I entered on there was quite dramatic. I didn't realize before that younger people, children or adolescents who are overprotected, who don't experience any adversity, end up less emotionally resilient, less able to tolerate pain, and more likely to be disabled if they do suffer something like lower back pain. Adversity in younger people has benefits. And I'm just wondering, have we reached a time where we're a very privileged section of society, older people, who are paying ourselves exceptionally well, in comparison to an relatively impoverished younger generation coming up. And I'm wondering, just forgetting equity and things like that, I'm just wondering to what extent this is bad for ourselves. So, I'll say one last thing. Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, all are smarter and bolder and less subject to age-related stereotypes because they have power. The power of celebrity, the power of politics, and power has remarkable effects in the human brain. It increases testosterone in both men and women, and that in turn increases the activity of the reward network in the brain and dopamine activity in the reward network of the brain. Dopamine activity in the reward network in the brain makes the frontal lobes of the brain function much better. The frontal lobes of the brain are the bits of the brain most vulnerable to aging. And they're the bits of the brain most challenged by work and demands and taking part in organising events like this. But power changes the chemistry of the brain in a very powerful way, as much as any wonder drug you could invent. Therefore, older people have to stop, in my opinion, disempowering themselves by withdrawing from active engagement in the workforce or in community or other activities. So finally, come back to the puzzle. Why is it that the moderately stressed people ended up maintaining their cognitive function? It wasn't severe stress. It wasn't death of a spouse. It wasn't death of a child. But it was serious illness of a spouse, even a stroke. It was conflict with family, conflict with neighbours. That moderate stress seemed to maintain cognitive functions. Why? Because stress, along with the challenges, the day-to-day challenges of work and of taking part in community activities, activates the fight-or-flight system in the brain. We're constantly rubbing against people. We're worrying, am I doing that? That generates another chemical messenger in the brain called noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is a wonder drug. If you invented it, you would get the Nobel Prize because it actually builds brain connections and it is actually toxic to some of the nasty plaques in the brain associated with Alzheimer's disease. So we have the capacity to generate, through our active engagement and a bit of stress involved in that, to generate ourselves a completely natural drug that builds stronger brains and actually protects us to some extent. Not perfectly and never guaranteed, but gives us relative protection against Alzheimer's disease. So what I say to you is, there were times in the Soviet Union when the heroes of the Soviet Union were all older people in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They were the ones, the Solzhenitsyns, and they were the ones circulating the banned literature, writing the banned literature. They were the rock stars of that time. I think we can all become, those of us over in the later stage of life, we have to become empowered by becoming the rock stars of this time. Thank you.